Try to picture something your children fight over at Halloween, something you hand to a lover on Valentine's Day, and then tell me how you feel knowing that 500 years ago, it was the currency used to buy human beings. Welcome to Zenith Massif. I am Lou. You can think of us as a concierge for new perspectives, the stories and adventures hidden in plain sight, and the kind of unrefined taste that doubles as an investment. Today, we are not talking about candy. We are tracing the hero's journey of cacao itself, a wild sovereign thing that began as the financial spine of an empire, survived kidnapping by colonial fleets, endured the brutality of the industrial machine, was nearly destroyed by monopoly, and was ultimately rescued by a handful of obsessive misfits who refused to let it be anything less than magnificent. Before the 16th century, cacao had nothing to do with botany in the Aztec world. It was money. Hard, regulated, imperial money. The Codex Mendoza, an Aztec tax ledger compiled shortly after the Spanish conquest, gives us the exchange rates. They read like a Bloomberg terminal with no sentiment whatsoever. A freshly caught rabbit, 10 beans. A large wild turkey, 20 beans. A healthy, able-bodied enslaved person, 100 beans precisely. When Montezuma II walked through his royal treasury, he was not looking at gold ingots or carved jade. He was walking through warehouses stacked with sikipio, the empire's standard unit of account, each sack holding exactly 24,000 cacao beans. His personal reserve has been estimated at over 960 million beans. Run that against spot prices on the ICE Futures Exchange today, and you are looking at a position any sovereign wealth fund would take seriously. And because it was currency, it attracted counterfeiters. Criminal networks collected discarded cacao shells, split them open with obsidian blades, hollowed them out, packed them with volcanic ash, charcoal, and melted beeswax, then resealed them and circulated them through the markets. The Aztec state deployed armed soldiers to guard cacao groves, the way a central bank guards its printing operations. A crop disease was a monetary crisis. Montezuma himself consumed the bean in its rawest, most imperial form. Every day, attendants used pure gold whisks to prepare chocolate, served in single-use golden cups that were melted down after each sitting. The drink bore no resemblance to the sweet hot chocolate you know. Ground chili, unripe vanilla pods, roasted maize flour, all combined into something dense, bitter, and forceful. Attendants poured it from shoulder height repeatedly to force a thick foam, and that foam was not decorative. It was the signal, the visible proof that you commanded enough labor and enough raw material to waste both on theater. No foam meant no status. The cup itself, solid gold, used once, destroyed, was the punctuation mark at the end of the statement. The Aztec sources record that Montezuma consumed between 50 and 100 of these cups per day. That number sounds absurd until you understand the caffeine and theobromine load of undiluted cacao in this preparation, a combination of compounds that, at that concentration and volume, functions less like a beverage and more like a sustained pharmacological state. He was not drinking chocolate. He was managing his neurochemistry with the most expensive tool his civilization had ever produced, at a rate that would stop most modern adults in their tracks. What Montezuma was drinking, in other words, was power, compressed into liquid form, served in a vessel too valuable to keep. When Spanish galleons carried the first cacao across the Atlantic, the bean arrived in Europe and encountered something it had never met before: refined white sugar. The combination hit European royal courts like a controlled substance, which functionally it was. The demand that followed rewrote the political map of the Americas and triggered a supply chain war that never really ended. Then, the trading companies arrived. Most people think of the British East India Company as a tea and opium operation. That is the simplified version. While the East India Company consolidated its grip on Asian trade routes, the Dutch West India Company and a consortium of London merchants identified something more structurally powerful: absolute control over the cacao and sugar supply chain in the Caribbean. Dutch privateers ran cacao out of Spanish-controlled territories at scale, routing it through Amsterdam, which became the world's largest cacao futures and processing hub almost overnight. These chartered companies invented a playbook that still runs today: lock up the upstream commodity through political monopoly, use financial instruments to control pricing, use military force to protect the logistics, 17th and 18th century cacao trading was the first live dress rehearsal for modern commodity markets. By the late 1600s, cacao had completed its first-class migration, and nowhere was that more visible than in two rooms on St. James Street in London. White's Chocolate House and the Cocoa Tree Club just down the road were not cafes. They were the operational headquarters of Tory aristocrats, East India Company directors, and the city's most powerful bond traders. A cup of Jamaican spiced cacao cost more than a laborer's weekly wage. Card games at those tables moved sums that would embarrass a modern trading floor. Political strategy was formed over cacao. Careers were ended. Intelligence changed hands. The Cocoa Tree Club in particular functioned as something close to a shadow cabinet. Decisions made there shaped parliamentary outcomes the following week. Cacao had gone from jungle ritual to the fuel of colonial capitalism, and the people drinking it in those rooms knew exactly what they were doing. The 19th century tried to do to cacao what it did to everything else: strip out all the unpredictability, standardize it, scale it, and flatten it into a product. Several of the brands that still dominate global shelf space were born in that attempt. In 1879, a Swiss manufacturer named Rodolphe Lindt left his factory on a Friday evening and forgot to switch off a machine he had designed himself, a heavy stone conching device that used granite rollers to process cacao paste. That machine ran for 72 uninterrupted hours over the weekend. When Lindt opened it Monday morning expecting a disaster, he found instead a liquid so smooth it moved like a mirror. The sustained mechanical friction had volatilized the residual bitter acids in the cacao and coated every microscopic particle in an even layer of cocoa butter. The first chocolate that melted on the tongue rather than requiring active chewing was born from an act of forgetfulness. The Lindt Group today reports annual revenues north of 5 billion Swiss francs. All of it traces back to that abandoned weekend. In 1908, Theodore Tobler launched Toblerone in Switzerland. The combination of milk chocolate, Italian nougat, honey, and almond pieces was distinctive enough. But Tobler's real move was filing the world's first shape patent on a food product, the triangular form, protected. The official story credits the Matterhorn for the silhouette. Parisian social circles have long preferred a different explanation. The shape replicates the human pyramid formed by the Moulin Rouge's can-can dancers at the finale. Take your pick. What matters structurally is that the triangle uses shear stress at a specific angle. A single downward thumb press snaps off a clean portion with satisfying precision. One geometric decision locked out every imitator for decades. Toblerone now sells over 100 million bars annually and remains Switzerland's single highest volume chocolate export. In America, the industrial era wore a different face entirely. In 1921, Charles C. opened the first See's Candies on Western Avenue in Los Angeles, built around his mother Mary's recipes and her image. Black and white apron, silver hair as the brand's permanent identity. See's established a retail discipline that looked almost irrational from the outside. No preservatives, fresh cream and butter sourced daily from local dairies. Shelf life so short the product simply could not be distributed internationally. That constraint, which looked like a weakness, became the premium signal among the affluent customers who could buy it fresh. When Berkshire Hathaway acquired See's in 1972 for $25 million, much of the investing world thought Buffett had overpaid. See's has since generated over $2 billion in pre-tax earnings for Berkshire, with Buffett raising prices every single year without losing a meaningful customer. He has called it his most instructive lesson in pricing power. Even mass-produced candy, when you look at it properly, can contain remarkable material intelligence. I have a ritual. When I eat a Ferrero Rocher, I never bite into it. I take it apart, layer by layer, the way you might disassemble a watch movement to understand how it holds time. First, you peel back the gold foil and remove the brown paper cup. Then, using only the lightest pressure from your front teeth, you crack and remove the outer shell, a matrix of milk chocolate and finely crushed roasted peanut. What's underneath is a complete sphere of wafer, fragile and geometrically precise. Split it along the equatorial seam, and you expose the hazelnut cream held in suspension by surface tension. Draw that out slowly, and at the geometric center of the entire structure sits a single whole hazelnut, low temperature roasted, never cracked, placed there with the logic of a keystone. making that multi-layer geometry hold together on an automated line at millions of units per day, while ensuring the wafer stays crisp for months against the moisture pressure of the cream surrounding it, requires water activity control and interfacial material design that would be recognizable in precision manufacturing. A confection that costs less than $1 carries engineering density that should not be underestimated. What I find genuinely interesting about this ritual is what it reveals about complexity and price. The Ferrero Rocher is not trying to be luxurious. It makes no claim to single origin terroir or artisan process. And yet the engineering problem it solves, keeping 5 distinct materials in stable, textural balance inside a sphere smaller than a golf ball across months of supply chain, is not a trivial one. The people who figured that out were not cutting corners. They were solving a real problem with considerable ingenuity. Regardless of the price point, precision does not belong exclusively to the expensive. In 1937, Colonel Paul Logan of the United States Army Quartermaster Corps walked into Hershey's headquarters with a specification sheet and a demand that no food manufacturer had ever received before. The requirements: each bar must weigh exactly 4 ounces. Caloric density must sustain a soldier through a full day of combat. The bar must remain solid at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the last requirement, which is the one worth pausing on. Logan told Hershey's, the bar must taste only slightly better than a boiled potato. Hershey's engineers were baffled. Their entire profession was oriented toward making things taste good. Logan's reasoning was coldly tactical. Chocolate makes people happy. Make it too good, and soldiers eat it on day one as a snack. The bar had to be genuinely unpleasant, something a man would only open when the alternative was starvation. It had to be the last resort, not the reward. The result, designated Ration D, was packed with oat flour and had the texture of a fired brick. The men who carried it through Normandy and across the Pacific called it Hitler's secret weapon. It also kept people alive when supply lines collapsed entirely. An engineered act of deliberate unpleasantness, deployed as a survival tool. Back to the present. Cacao today is not an agricultural product in any simple sense. It is a geopolitical commodity, and it has never escaped the gravitational pull of monopoly. 3 companies, Cargill, Barry Callebaut, and Olam International, collectively control over 70% of the world's cacao processing and logistics infrastructure. Barry Callebaut alone processes more than 600,000 metric tons of cacao per year and supplies the raw material to over 2,000 chocolate brands, including a significant number of labels that market themselves as independent artisan operations. None of these 3 names appear on any consumer packaging. They are the actual kingmakers of the entire industry. Between 2023 and 2024, cacao futures on the ICE and the LIFFE exchanges broke through $12,000 per metric ton, more than triple the price of 2 years prior. At the peak, cacao's unit price exceeded copper. That spike attracted a wave of hedge funds that had never traded an agricultural commodity in their lives, and for several months, cacao was the highest performing commodity in any asset class. Soft commodity desks that had ignored it for years were suddenly paying attention. The underlying cause was structural, not cyclical. Ivory Coast and Ghana together supply roughly 60% of the world's cacao. Decades of underinvestment in agricultural infrastructure, aging tree stock that should have been replaced a generation ago, the spread of black pod disease and swollen shoot virus through plantations, and a severe El Niño drought conspired to collapse the supply chain simultaneously. The downstream effects were immediate and visible to anyone paying attention. Toblerone quietly narrowed the gaps between its triangles. Cadbury shaved millimeters off its bars. Hershey reformulated several products, substituting palm oil for cocoa butter. Shrinkflation as a stress signal. At the other end of the market, something entirely different was happening. The ultra-premium sector decoupled from commodity pricing completely. High net worth buyers began treating top-tier chocolate the way they treat allocated wine futures or limited edition watchmaking, as objects whose value is set entirely by botanical scarcity, not by market fluctuation. The apex of that scarcity belongs to a Peruvian variety called Pure National. It was declared globally extinct in 1916, after a root rot pandemic wiped out the crop. In 2007, A handful of specimens were found alive in the near vertical limestone walls of the Marañón Canyon, a canyon so remote and so geographically hostile that it had been effectively sealed off from the outside world for a century. DNA sequencing confirmed the trees were genetically intact, no hybridization with inferior commercial stock, none. 40% of the beans produced there carry a spontaneous white mutation. No tannins, no astringency, no bitterness. What they release when melted is a clarity of flavor, white flowers, tropical stone fruit, the exact texture of fresh walnut flesh that exists nowhere else in cultivated cacao. The supply constraint is not a marketing position, it is a geological and biological fact. The entire Marañón Canyon produces an estimated 20 metric tons per year at maximum. The farmers there work by hand, on slopes that no equipment can access. 20 tons is not enough to supply even the smallest serious chocolate brand on a consistent basis. To obtain a bar made from this material, you enter a private allocation list, maintained by a very small number of independent masters. Then you wait. No amount of capital accelerates the process. Geography and biology set the terms, and they are not negotiating. For people accustomed to money solving most access problems, that is a genuinely unusual situation. There are very few things on earth where the constraint is not price, not connection, not influence, but simply the physical output of a canyon in Peru, worked by hand, bounded by limestone walls on three sides. The allocation list moves when the harvest allows it to move, and not before. Pure National is perhaps the clearest example in the food world of something that cannot be manufactured into availability. The rescue of cacao from industrial mediocrity did not happen quietly. It happened through confrontation, and no confrontation was more perfectly structured than what took place in Tuscany in the early 1990s. Cecilia Tessieri co-founded Amedei in Italy and traveled to France to purchase premium cacao from Valrhona, at the time, the French house that held a near monopoly on fine cacao sourcing globally. Valrhona turned her down. The company's representative told her, without apparent embarrassment, that an Italian workshop with no heritage lacked the genetic predisposition to understand great cacao. The phrase was designed to end the conversation. It had the opposite effect. Tessieri cut out every European intermediary and went directly to the source she identified as the finest cacao in the world, Chuao, a coastal village on the northern coast of Venezuela. Three sides of the valley are enclosed by the dense canopy of Henri Pittier National Park. The fourth side opens onto the Caribbean. There is no road into Chuao. The only entry is by wooden fishing boat, navigating open water for several hours through significant swell. That isolation, sustained over centuries, produced something irreplaceable. Chuao's Criollo cacao trees, the original unmanipulated strain of the bean that once funded the Aztec Empire, had never been crossed with the hardier but inferior strains that replaced them everywhere else on Earth. The volcanic ash soil and the specific humidity profile created by that geography produce a flavor complexity that cannot be replicated at any other coordinate. Valrhona had known this for decades and held the village's entire annual output under exclusive contract, quietly, as the flavor core of its most expensive product lines. Tessieri arrived in Chuao alone. She did not go to the administrative office. She sat down with the farmers on the bamboo drying platforms where the cacao was laid out. She offered double what Valrhona was paying, paid directly, no middlemen, no futures market between them and the money. She funded new drainage infrastructure, upgraded the fermentation vats, and arranged long-term legal protections for the farming families. In 2002, Amedei signed an exclusive agreement with the Chuao Cooperative and acquired the village's entire output. Valrhona found out when the supply simply stopped arriving. A woman with no inherited capital and no institutional backing had used the farmers' trust to execute a precision strike that severed the French house's most critical raw material line overnight. The aftermath was instructive. Valrhona had to quietly reformulate the flagship products that had been built on Chuao as their signature flavor, a reformulation their most attentive customers noticed, even if the press release described it as a refinement. The sensory gap left by losing Chuao cacao is not the kind of thing you can fill with a new processing technique. The raw material either has that particular volcanic soil depth or it does not. Amedei's Chuao Bar, a single origin dark chocolate named directly after the village, went on to win the Academy of Chocolate's top award multiple years running and became one of the most discussed bars among serious collectors worldwide. At its peak, secondary market prices for limited production runs exceeded retail by a factor of 3 or 4. The humiliation had been repaid with compound interest, and the currency was reputation, not money. That obsession, the refusal to let cacao be ordinary, reached its most extreme expression in Paris, where 4 makers of radically different temperament each conducted their own campaign to return the bean to something worthy of itself. Jacques Genin, the press calls him the ironsmith of cacao, maintains exactly 2 shops in Paris. He has turned down every offer to expand. His position: the moment a craftsman is managing more than 20 locations, he has become an executive in a chef's coat, not a maker. His fresh mint ganache contains no industrial menthol, none. Every morning his team picks dew-wet mint leaves from a private garden and cold infuses them directly into heavy cream. The result is a clarity of herbal flavor that does not survive logistics, does not survive a long shelf, does not survive anything except eating it within the window Janin considers acceptable. That constraint is the whole point. Across the Seine, Patrick Roger, holder of the Meilleur Ouvrier de France, France's highest craft designation. Roger operates a temperature-controlled sculpture studio, where he works with chainsaws, lathes, and iron chisels on multi-ton solid blocks of dark curvature. Endangered orangutans, polar bears, African elephants, he sends the finished pieces to contemporary art galleries, shown alongside bronze and marble. His signature confection, Amazon, is a jade green hemisphere that fractures on light pressure, releasing an interior of high-acid lime caramel that hits the palate with the force of something that has no interest in being polite. Roger's flavor logic is about sensory shock, not comfort. His work splits the Paris food world cleanly. Some call it provocation. Others say this is what cacao felt like before industry spent a century teaching it to be inoffensive. Both readings are defensible. Pierre Marcolini, in Brussels and Paris, is the godfather of the bean-to-bar movement. The insistence that fine chocolate must be traceable to a specific farm, a specific harvest, handled by the maker from raw bean to finished bar with no intermediary processing. Marcolini spends more than half of every year in remote growing regions, Cuba, Peru, India, Madagascar, working directly with micro-producers, bypassing the futures market entirely. He removes the heavy sugar and synthetic vanilla that mass producers use to mask inferior raw material, and exposes the terroir of each origin, the specific sunlight, rainfall, and wild yeast of that plot that year. His logic is identical to a serious Burgundy producer's. The same land in a difficult vintage produces something tighter, more angular. In a generous year, something rounder, with longer finish. Single origin chocolate read this way stops being a confection and becomes something closer to a document. Jean-Paul Hevan, the coldest intellect of the 4. His flagships in Tokyo's Ginza district and Kyoto run double-sealed glass doors and industrial air filtration systems that lock internal humidity at 50% and temperature at 18 degrees Celsius, eliminating any atmospheric fluctuation that might degrade the surface crystalline structure of his ganache. Heaven was the first person to successfully integrate Roquefort's fungal, saline complexity, and Islay single malts peat smoke and iodine into dark chocolate ganache, achieving a dynamic balance of salt, smoke, bitterness, and restrained sweetness that holds together at the molecular level. Calling it a flavor combination undersells it. It is precision engineering applied to sensation. When you eat it, the sequence arrives in distinct waves. The smoke first, then the salt finding the back of the jaw, then the bitterness of the cacao catching up and holding everything in suspension. It does not resolve into sweetness. It simply holds and then fades cleanly. Heaven would consider a lingering sweetness a failure. Between them, Janin's obsessive freshness, Roger's confrontational force, Marcolini's archival rigor, Heaven's molecular precision, these 4 represent what cacao looks like when someone refuses to apologize for what it actually is, not a confection, not a comfort, a material with a 500-year history of being traded, kidnapped, industrialized, monopolized, and very nearly destroyed, and an extraordinary capacity to reward the people who pay it proper attention. The hero's journey of cacao ends not in a supermarket, not in a commodity warehouse in Amsterdam, but in rooms exactly like theirs. Small, controlled, obsessive, and absolutely delicious. The next time you break a piece of dark chocolate, that clean, sharp snap, hold it there for a moment. What you're holding is a 500-year survivor, a thing that once funded an empire, that was kidnapped and industrialized and nearly standardized into nothing, that was almost wiped off the face of the earth by blight, and that was pulled back, piece by piece, by people too stubborn and too obsessed to let it disappear. What you put in your mouth is more than calories. It is a compressed argument about what human beings are willing to protect, and occasionally about what they are willing to fight a French monopoly to recover. What's your favorite chocolate maker, origin, or just the one you keep going back to? Leave a comment or come find us in the Substack community. Looking ahead to our next episode, we'll be exploring a specific, understated neighborhood in Los Angeles, the kind of enclave where the architecture is as quiet as the residents, and where you might find yourself picking up your morning espresso right next to a familiar face from the silver screen. I'll see you there.